Angela Morris thought she was chasing love, but Chloe Morris knew from the moment her mother boarded that plane to Istanbul that something was terribly wrong, and what followed would unravel their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. Angela Morris always believed she was destined for more than the life she was living. At 38, she felt stuck in a small house on the edge of Manchester, surrounded by gossiping neighbors and bills that never stopped piling up. She worked part-time at a local supermarket, her hours long and her pay barely enough to cover food and electricity. Nights were spent scrolling through her phone, staring at images of places she thought she would never see, sunlit beaches, glittering cities, and couples smiling under foreign skies. Her daughter, Chloe, was her only source of joy, but even motherhood couldn't erase the emptiness Angela felt inside. It was during one of these late nights that she stumbled into an online chat room, a space full of strangers from all over the world. Among them was Kemal Yildiz, a charming man from Istanbul who seemed to know exactly what to say. He told her she was beautiful, that she deserved better, that he wanted to show her the wonders of his city. Unlike the men Angela had known, Kemal painted a picture of a future filled with warmth and adventure. His words made her feel alive again, as though someone finally saw her not as a struggling single mother, but as a woman with dreams. Their conversations grew longer and more intimate. He sent her pictures of himself smiling against the backdrop of the Bosporus, messages written in careful English, promises of love and stability. Angela began to believe she had found not only a partner, but also an escape from the gray routine of her life. What started as curiosity became obsession. For the first time in years, Angela felt she had a reason to hope, and the thought of Istanbul burned brighter in her mind than the responsibilities she was leaving behind. The morning Angela was due to leave for Istanbul carried a heavy silence that weighed on every corner of the small suburban house. Chloe, just 15, sat at the kitchen table watching her mother rush around with suitcases, her face pale with disbelief. Angela tried to convince herself this was a bold step toward happiness, but deep down, guilt gnawed at her. She told Chloe it was only temporary, that once she and Kemal were settled, money would start flowing back home, and life would finally improve for both of them. Chloe didn't believe a word of it. To her, it felt like abandonment wrapped in pretty promises. Angela's sister, tasked with caring for Chloe, arrived just before they left for the airport. She offered Angela a strained smile, but her eyes betrayed judgment and worry. Chloe clung to her mother at the front door, begging her to stay, her voice cracking with desperation. Angela forced herself to hug her daughter tightly, whispering reassurances she barely believed. In her heart, she thought she was choosing love, a choice she convinced herself would eventually benefit them both. Yet as she pulled away, she couldn't ignore the coldness in Chloe's stare, a look that seemed to say she was being left behind for good. At the airport, the atmosphere was chaotic, but inside Angela, everything was unnervingly still. She checked her phone constantly, where Kemal's messages awaited, full of hearts and promises. She held onto those words like lifelines, even as her daughter's final pleas echoed in her ears. As she walked through the departure gates, she didn't look back, fearing her resolve would crumble. Chloe stood there in tears, watching the woman who had always been her anchor vanish into the crowd, not knowing it was the last safe moment they would share. When Angela arrived in Istanbul, the city felt like another world entirely. The air was thick with noise, street vendors calling out, car horns blaring, the scent of roasted chestnuts drifting through the chaos. For a woman who had lived her whole life in a quiet English suburb, the energy was overwhelming but also intoxicating. She clutched her suitcase tightly as she walked through the arrival's gate, scanning the crowd until she spotted him. Kemal stood there with a bouquet of red roses, his smile wide and reassuring. For a fleeting moment, Angela felt all her doubts dissolve. Kemal treated her like royalty in those first days. He showed her the shimmering waters of the Bosporus, the winding streets filled with history, and the bustling markets that seemed endless. He introduced her to neighbors as his future wife and spoke of building a life together. Angela believed every word. When he rented her a small but cozy apartment, she thought it was proof of his commitment. She sent pictures back home, hoping to ease Chloe's resentment, but her daughter's replies were distant, filled with worry she tried to ignore. It didn't take long before Kemal began asking for money. At first, it was small amounts, a few £100s for paperwork, then more for rent and business deals he insisted would secure their future. Angela hesitated, but when he wrapped his arms around her and spoke of their dreams, she gave in. Within weeks, her savings account was bleeding dry. She noticed subtle changes in him too. His temper flared more often, his phone rang at odd hours, and he disappeared for long stretches without explanation. Still, she told herself it was stress, that every couple faced challenges. What Angela didn't realize was that her dream life in Istanbul was already beginning to fracture. The longer Angela stayed in Istanbul, the more cracks appeared in the picture-perfect life Kemal had promised. What once felt like a romantic adventure began to resemble a cage. He had taken control of her passport, claiming it was safer in his possession. He convinced her to transfer her remaining savings into his account, assuring her it was for their shared future. Angela, blinded by the hope of lasting love, obeyed. It wasn't until the bank balance dwindled to nothing that she realized she no longer had any independence. Kemal's absences grew longer, and his explanations became vaguer. He muttered about business trips and important meetings, but Angela noticed the lies stacking up. Once, she followed him discreetly down the crowded streets, only to see him with another woman, a foreigner like her, clinging to his arm. The shock nearly crushed her, but she said nothing when he returned that night. The fear of losing him was stronger than her anger, though inside, her trust was collapsing. The apartment that had once seemed charming grew suffocating. Kemal began monitoring her phone calls and discouraging her from contacting Chloe. Whenever she tried to protest, his demeanor shifted from sweet to menacing in an instant. He raised his voice, sometimes his hand, and Angela learned quickly that silence kept her safe. She discovered unsettling hints about him from neighbors. Whispers that Kemal had done this before, that she was not his first foreign fiancé. Some of the women had disappeared without a trace. The realization filled her with dread, but she had no money, no documents, and no allies in a city she barely understood. What had begun as a fantasy of love and freedom was now a web of control and fear, and Angela was caught in it with no clear escape. Back in Manchester, Chloe's life unraveled slowly but painfully. At 15, she was left in her aunt's care, but no one could fill the void her mother had left behind. She went through her days like a ghost, silent at school, withdrawn from her friends, and consumed by worry at night. At first, Angela sent long, cheerful messages filled with pictures of Istanbul and glowing descriptions of her new life. Chloe read them with a mix of relief and bitterness, convinced her mother was hiding the truth behind forced smiles. Then, as weeks passed, the messages shortened into brief updates, sometimes just a line. Eventually, they stopped altogether. Chloe tried to call, but her mother never picked up. She sent dozens of texts that remained unanswered. Each day, she checked her phone obsessively, hoping for a reply that never came. Fear crept in where anger had once lived. She began searching the internet for stories of women traveling abroad for love, and what she discovered horrified her. Articles spoke of romance scams, disappearances, and cases where women ended up trapped in dangerous situations they couldn't escape. Every headline felt like it was written about her mother. Her aunt tried to reassure her, saying Angela was probably busy or having phone problems, but Chloe knew better. The silence screamed louder than words. She started keeping a notebook, recording every detail she could remember about Kemal, the photos he had sent, the messages her mother had shared, even his promises. It was her way of holding onto a trail that felt like it was vanishing before her eyes. Each night, she cried herself to sleep with the sinking realization that her fears were coming true. The mother who had once been her protector might now be the one in need of saving. The night Angela tried to reach Chloe was the first real sign that something was terribly wrong. Borrowing a phone from a woman she briefly befriended in the neighborhood, she managed to place a short call. Her voice shook as she whispered Chloe's name, but before she could explain, the line went dead. Chloe stared at her screen in shock, dialing back again and again with no answer. That desperate, broken voice would be the last she ever heard from her mother. Days later, Angela's apartment was found in disarray. Her suitcase lay open on the floor, clothes spilling out as though she had been packing in a hurry. The roses Kemal had once brought her were wilted in a vase by the window, their petals scattered across the table. But Angela herself was gone, and so was Kemal. Neighbors claimed they hadn't seen him for several days. Others whispered that he had left in the night with another woman. The police were called, but their investigation was slow and limited. Angela was a foreigner in a city full of missing women, and her case was just another file among many. Rumors swirled through the small network of foreign women living in Istanbul. Some said Kemal was part of a larger operation that targeted lonely women from abroad, taking their money and discarding them when they were no longer useful. Others insisted Angela had been trafficked, sold into a life she could never escape. Nothing could be proven. The only certainty was that she had vanished, leaving her daughter thousands of miles away with nothing but questions. Chloe held on to the hope that her mother was still alive, but deep down she knew that every day without news meant the chances of seeing her again were slipping further away. Years passed, but Chloe never found peace. What began as waiting for a phone call became a lifetime of unanswered questions. She grew older, carrying with her the shadow of her mother's disappearance. Friends moved on with their lives, building families and careers, but Chloe remained tethered to a mystery she could never untangle. Every birthday, every holiday, she imagined her mother's face appearing at the door, only to be met by silence. The grief was not sharp anymore. It was heavy, constant, like a stone tied to her chest. Investigators eventually closed Angela's file as unresolved, but Chloe refused to let it go. She contacted private agencies, joined online forums, and spoke with other children of missing parents. What she discovered only deepened her pain. There were dozens of women, all lured by promises of romance in foreign cities, all vanishing under similar circumstances. Some were found years later in horrific conditions, while others were never seen again. Each story echoed her mother's, reminding Chloe of the dangers Angela had ignored in pursuit of love. Kemal's name surfaced occasionally in rumors, but never in official reports. Some said he had fled the country. Others claimed he was still in Istanbul under a different identity. Chloe imagined him moving on easily, while her own life remained frozen in loss. She realized the true price of her mother's choices was not just Angela's disappearance, but the destruction it left behind for those who loved her. Chloe eventually built a life of her own, but it was one shaped by caution and mistrust. She learned to recognize the traps of false affection, the masks worn by predators. Angela's fate remained a wound that never healed, a story unfinished. The terrible price of blind hope became Chloe's lifelong burden.